It's on? Okay. Wherever I've gone throughout the world, no matter what culture, no matter what civilization, all people have cultivated a system of worship. The object of the worship may vary, but the idea of a higher power does not. And this is throughout history. There's something that's built into the human being that is looking for something to worship. And the wisest man that ever lived, Solomon said in Ecclesiastes that God has given human beings an awareness of eternity. We don't always know what that eternity is, but we have this sense that there's something more to life than just this life that we live on earth. I talk to people all throughout the world, and they all say this. So today we're going to hear from God about this afterlife, if you will, okay? Just put up that first screen. These are the terms that we're going to make very simple, and I want to preempt it by saying you're going to see that heaven, paradise, and Abraham's side are all one and the same. You can use those terms interchangeably. And then you're going to see that hell, Gehenna, and the lake of fire are all one and the same. You're going to be able to use those terms interchangeably. So it's not nearly as complicated as I think a lot of people make it. Sheol and Hades are one and the same. One's Hebraic, one's Greek, and they're different than heaven and hell. They're a holding tank for the non-believer until the end of the millennium. We're going to go over this. I just want to preempt it so you're not too fuzzy up front. Because a lot of you come into the Messianic movement, not that this is Messianic, this is just Bible. And what I teach is Bible. I don't teach Messianic Judaism. I teach the Bible. You know what I mean? But with that being said, I think some of you come into the Messianic movement, I always hear this, you go, I have so much to learn. Who told you that? Who communicated that to you? How much do you have to learn before you share the gospel with your neighbor? I've seen people get saved in India and they share the gospel an hour later. In the Bible, they were saved and they shared the gospel that day. Some people 30, 40 years saved and they're still thinking, well, I need to learn more before I share the gospel. No, you don't. It's quite simple, the gospel. How much do you need to learn before you can be kind to somebody in need? And to get out of yourself a little bit. I meet people, they go, what is the Lord telling you, Rabbi? What's the Lord telling you? The Lord's telling me not to think so much about me and to think about others. What is he telling you? Everybody wants to talk about what the Lord is telling them. Well, what the Lord said to me, tell me, dear. What did the Lord say to you that's different than what he said in the Bible? Because I thought he said that we should love him more than ourselves and love everybody else like ourselves. I thought that was pretty much the routine. Oh, well, he's telling me. We're going to get into that too, about these grandiose visions and revelations that people have. You cannot discuss, biblically speaking, life, death, and the afterlife without mentioning the parable of the rich man and Eleazar, a.k.a. Lazarus. Obviously, his name is Lazarus in the New Testament, but he was a Jewish guy. Nobody names a Jewish guy Lazarus, okay? His name was Eleazar. This is the quintessential story when discussing the afterlife. In this story, we have some of the greatest contrast, if not the greatest contrast, that the Bible has to offer. We have two lives, we have two deaths, and we have two eternities. It couldn't be more crystal clear than that parable. So let's have a look. We'll break it down a little bit. It starts out in verse 19 of chapter 16, verse 19 in chapter 16 of the book of Luke. It says, and I quote, once there was a rich man who used to dress in the most expensive clothing and spent his days in magnificent luxury. At his gate had been laid a beggar named Eleazar, who was covered with sores. He would have been glad to eat the scraps that fell from the rich man's table, but instead, even the dogs would come and lick his sores. So first we have the rich man introduced to us. He wears the finest clothes. I'm smiling, and I'll tell you why maybe. He wore robes of purple. Purple were for the royal, wealthy people in this day that Yeshua is speaking about. And that purple was made from mollusks, shellfish, from Tyre. So you had to get these mollusks. You know how you had to harvest mollusks and get the purple dye in order to turn the linen into these purple robes. Expensive, right? Expensive, the most expensive. He also wore linen shirts from Egyptian cotton. Nothing was better than the cotton in Egypt. He had a home, but it was a gated estate. A lot of people read this and they think the man was dropped at his front door. I mean, that's ludicrous. He was dropped at his gate, which was far from his house, because this is not a house, it's an estate. And when you went into the estate, it had these lush manicured gardens. And in this palatial estate, it had the finest of furniture, along with priceless works of art. And his marble floors, of course, from Italy, were just magnificent. In fact, you could see the reflection of yourself in the sheen, which I'm sure all his rich guests love to look at themselves in the floor, if not the mirrors. His table is a smorgasbord of gourmet foods, the finest meats, the finest fowl, the finest seafood that money could buy, the choicest and most seasonal fruits and vegetables, and the finest of wines from the world's best vineyards, not to mention all his servants. Then there's Eleazar, the beggar, dumped at the rich man's gate like a sack of garbage, probably brought there by those who wanted him out of their neighborhood. He's pitiful, like a bag of bones, emaciated with hunger, his body full of oozing sores, and plagued by unclean dogs who come to lick his wounds. The rich man lived for self, catering to bodily pleasures and appetites. He had no genuine love for God and no care for his fellow man. Eleazar was hoping that maybe, just maybe, one of the guests at the many parties might bring him some of the table scraps that fell on the floor. But sadly enough, at the rich man's estate, mercy is the one thing in short supply. Let's move on to the next verse. In time, the beggar died and was carried away by angels to Abraham's side. The rich man also died and was buried. So the beggar died and was carried off by angels to Abraham's side. Many question, I'm sure, whether angels actually participate in carrying the souls of believers to heaven. I see no reason for doubting the plain force of words. Angels minister to believers in this life, and there is no reason why they should not do it at the time of death. Abraham's side is a symbolic expression to denote the place of bliss. You understand? Yeshua has not spoken to any Gentile, nor did he in his whole ministry. He's speaking to Jewish people as a Jewish rabbi in a Jewish place. It is 100% kosher. He's speaking from a Jewish person in a Jewish culture, so when you don't understand the culture, and you're looking at it Western eyes, or Christian eyes, or Gentile eyes, you're going to miss the story. And that's what's missing. It is missing. So Abraham's side, who is this Abraham? Well, he's the father of three major religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. And he's our guy. He's our patriarch. It's the most important covenant that God made with Abraham, that he was going to save the world. So this is symbolic to denote a place of bliss. In other words, to any Jewish person in the first century, the thought of enjoying fellowship with Abraham would express inexpressible joy. We take it that Abraham's bosom is heaven. Next two verses. In Sheol, or I put parentheses Hades, because this is the Jewish version, but Hades is the same word. Where he was in torment, the rich man looked up and saw Abraham far away with Eleazar at his side. He called out, "Father Abraham," so you know he's Jewish, "take pity on me and send Eleazar just to dip the tip of his finger in water to cool off my tongue, because I'm in agony in this fire." So not only was the rich man's body buried in death, but his soul, or conscious self, went to Sheol, or Hades in the Greek, which is the abode of the unsaved. You follow? That's, if you're unsaved, if you would die today and you were unsaved, you go to this place called Hades. You don't go to heaven. Okay? Make no mistake. There is no purgatory. There's no intermediate place. It is appointed for a man to die once. Reincarnation does not exist one time and then be judged. Okay, you can't pray him out. Since the rich man was in torment, I need to make a few points. Okay? Point one, it should be made clear that the unnamed rich man was not condemned to Hades because of his wealth. Do you understand that? If you read this wrong, you're going to think, okay, he went to Hades because he was rich. No. No, Abraham was incredibly wealthy, and he didn't go to Hades. The basis of salvation is faith in Messiah Yeshua, and men are condemned for refusing to believe on him. This particular rich man showed that he did not have true saving faith by his careless disregard of the beggar whom was laid at his gate. If he had the love of God in him, he could not have lived in luxury, comfort, and ease while a fellow man was outside his front door begging for a few crumbs of bread. He would have entered violently. The violent take the kingdom by force. He would have entered violently into the kingdom by abandoning his love for money. That was his sin, his love for money. It must have come as a shock to the disciples that the rich man went to Hades, as they were taught, these Jewish people were taught, that riches is a sign of God's blessing and favor. We read that in Leviticus 26 and Deuteronomy 28. In the Torah, we are promised material blessing for obedience. However, riches are also, and hear me, a test of man's faithfulness and stewardship. To whom much is given, you got it. Number two, it is likewise true that Eleazar was not saved because of his poverty. He had trusted the Lord for salvation of his soul. Poverty is not necessarily a virtue. And number three, this narrative disproves the idea of soul sleep, the theory that the soul is not conscious between death and resurrection. It proves that there is a conscious existence beyond the grave. In fact, you should be struck by the extent of knowledge which the rich man had. He saw Abraham far off in the distance at the side of Eleazar. He was even able to communicate with Abraham, calling him Father Abraham. He begged for mercy, pleading that Eleazar might bring him a drop of water and cool his tongue. There is the question of how a disembodied soul can experience thirst and anguish from a flame. I can't give you all the answers, but I can only conclude for you that the language is figurative, and that does not mean that the suffering was not real. You follow? Just listen to this again, because you're not going to get it all in one time, and it's sad when you don't listen a second time. I'm just telling you, there's too much to be had, and you're not going to digest it, and it's important. Luke 16:25. However, Abraham said, "Son, remember that when you were alive, you got the good things while he got the bad? But now he gets his consolation here while you were the one in agony." So Abraham addressed him as son, suggesting that he was a descendant physically, though obviously not spiritually. You follow? He was a Jewish man by birth, but not spiritually. The patriarch reminded him of his lifetime of luxury, ease, and indulgence, as well as the poverty and the suffering of Eleazar. Now beyond the grave, the tables were turned. Eleazar was once dumped in torment outside the gates of the rich man's estate. The rich man is now outside of heaven's gate, lying in the torment of his own. Verse 26, yet that isn't all. Between you and us is a deep rift that has been established, so that those who would like to pass from here to you cannot, nor can anyone cross over from there to us. I mean, didn't these 1.5 billion Catholics read their Bible? No offense, my wife was raised Catholic, and my best friend is Catholic, and I have another best friend who's Catholic, and they're wonderful people. It doesn't mean that all Catholic people, like some Southern Baptists think, are going to hell. I got news for you. There's going to be a quite number of Southern Baptists that won't be in heaven. The fact of the matter is, though, the idea of purgatory doesn't exist. It's either here or there. There's no door number 3. So we learn here that the choices of this life determine our eternal destiny. Once death has taken place, that destiny is fixed forever. There is no passage from the abode of the saved to the damned, and vice versa. In the midst of all the technicalities of this message, don't miss the message. The message of this parable is better to beg for bread on earth than to beg for water in Hades. So here we see that heaven and Abraham's side are one and the same. Okay? Don't get caught up. Abraham's side is only mentioned one time. I know people that make a whole theology of one verse. Predestination, Romans 8, one verse. And they have a whole denomination over one verse. It's insanity, and it's not appropriate in studying the Bible. So we got heaven and Abraham's side that are the same. Now we have to look at paradise. Let's look at 2 Corinthians 12, 2 through 4. I love this. I love all of it. I can't get enough of it, to be perfectly frank. 2 Corinthians 12, 2 through 4, this is really a love letter, to Corinth, which was a problem-racked church. They abused tongues. They had divisions. They had marital issues, sexual issues. They were as dysfunctional as a church could be. They don't come any more dysfunctional. But also, we have a chapter in this dysfunctional letter that is one of the most beautiful chapters on the subject of love written in all of literature, not just the Bible. This is Paul speaking to the people of Corinth, and he says, I know a man in union with the Messiah, a believer, who 14 years ago was snatched up to the third heaven. Whether he was in the body or outside the body, I don't know. God knows. There's just some things, pal, that God's going to know that you're not. Why don't you bow to God already? Stop with your study. It's not making you any more attractive to the Holy Spirit. And I know that such a man, whether he was in the body or apart from the body, I don't know, says it a second time because there's always going to be people, I know. He's saying, no, you don't. God knows. He was snatched into paradise and heard things that cannot be put into words, things unlawful for a human being to utter. Sadly enough, Paul went to this place, Corinth, and preached in Acts, and some believers came to fruition. And as soon as he left, they went nuts. Why? Because Satan sent in his minions, and they started abusing tongues. They were abusing gifts. They were out of control. They were a wreck. He said, you're sleeping with your mother-in-law, and you're applauding it? You're not even saying anything? It was insanity. And he was broken. This was one of his babies, like his children. He's not married, doesn't have any children of his own. He's broken. So he writes this second letter, and they're not even listening to him anymore. So you know what he has to do? He has to boast. And do you know what that meant for him? Do you know what it meant for a humble man like Paul? It was killing him. He says, I don't want to boast, but you're making me because that's how much I love you. So what is he doing here in this letter? He's supporting his apostleship. He has to support. He has to like these other guys that came in. They're wolves in sheep's clothing. They're going to tear your soul apart. I love you. And so he has to give them a revelation to impress them. Does he want to? It's killing him. Because he's truly humble, which is very hard to come by. Let me add. So, let's look at the first verse. I know a man in union with the Messiah who 14 years ago was snatched up to the third heaven. Paul knew a man who had this experience 14 years ago. What are we talking about? 42 AD if you check the book of Acts. When did Paul have his encounter on the Damascus Road? 35 AD. So this is 7 years later. Okay, hear me. This is right prior to his first missionary journey. How important do you think it is for him to be filled up with the Spirit before he goes off to these unfavorable lands to preach the gospel? Does Paul identify this man? Guys, there's no question that he himself is the man. There's no question. There's not a decent theologian that doesn't know that. Why do I say that? Because in speaking of such an exalted experience, he won't mention himself personally. He'll simply speak in a general way. The Lord allowed him this experience, which would give him the zealous passion to relentlessly preach the gospel, unabashed and unashamed. Think about it logically. Why would Paul just believe some random person that they saw heaven? For that matter, why do you? Did anybody ever buy that book, those books that are out? I Saw Heaven? Come on, admit it, you little liar. Okay, let's move on. He's the man, okay? No question. He's the man. And God's giving him this 7 years later because 7 is the number for spiritual perfection. And God met him personally, but then he had to pump him up to get him out because he was going to preach the gospel to the horrific Gentiles who are throwing their kids to the fire and having sex with their daughters. It was a heathen culture. And he needed the power. And he needed the zeal. 2 Corinthians 12:3. He then says, I know that such a man, still calling it such a man, not even mentioning himself. Isn't that beautiful? So beautiful if you think about it. I know such a man, whether in the body or apart from the body. It reminds me of my friends in India. When you ask them, how's the ministry going? You know what they say? His ministry is going well. They never say my before ministry. Yeah, not American, that's for sure. And I know that such a man, whether in the body or apart from the body, I don't know, God knows. Paul does not know whether he was in the body or out of the body at the time. Some have conjectured this might have happened during one of Paul's persecutions. If you read some theologians, they say, well, it happened in Lystra. They say that he might have actually died and gone to heaven. But the text doesn't say that. Why would they say that? In fact, if Paul did not know whether he was in the body or out of the body, that is, alive or dead. That's what it means. That if he was dead and went to heaven, or he was alive and went to heaven, transported. How strange is it that modern commentators can throw additional light on the subject? Well, that you could, for that matter. The important thing is that the man was caught up to the third heaven, which is the dwelling place of God. Don't get too caught up with first and second and third heavens. That's very mystical, very metaphysical, and very Hindu. Okay? Don't get caught up in that. Because if you think about that, you'll think, well, the first heaven is the sky, and then the second heaven is the planets and the solar system, and the third heaven is beyond that. No, the place of God's dwelling is way beyond anything physical. So don't think linear, okay? 2 Corinthians 12:4, last verse here. And I know that such a man was snatched into paradise and heard things that cannot be put into words, things unlawful for a human being to utter. This is priceless. So he's saying that the words, he heard things, but the words are inexpressible in the sense that they are too sacred to be spoken and therefore not for publication. So do you think all these books are written are legit? The great apostle Paul says, I went there and I heard things I can't share, but they can. It's too sacred, but it's not sacred anymore. Let me just add this in here. Forgive me for the snide look. There are some way too eager to talk about their visions and revelations, which they have had. Maybe such eagerness is proof that the visions and the revelations are not of the Lord. When they are granted, and they are, they should produce such a reverence that they are too solemn and too overwhelming to be described or discussed lightly. When I had my Damascus Road experience, guys, I didn't share it for 3 years. I didn't know you could. It was too sacred. I just didn't feel comfortable sharing it. It's like sharing about your privacy. You know, your home is like your den is like the outer courtyard, you know? And your table is like the holy place. You don't let just anybody at the table. But the bedroom, that's the holy of holies, man. Nobody goes in there. Even Elvis knew that. Elvis never let anybody in his bedroom. No how, no way. When people stayed over, that was off limits because it was sacred to him. When you get these revelations, why don't you first check with God if you're supposed to talk about it? And what's the purpose of talking about him so much? Hey, I'm special. I get revelations. Just hear it, okay? Just hear me. So here we learn from this section of Scripture that heaven, Abraham's side, and paradise are all the same, and therefore the terms can be used interchangeably. Okay? We're on the same page? Because that's the biblical truth. There's no refutation of that. All right. Sheol and Hades, on the other hand, are temporary places where souls are kept as they await the final resurrection. And I'll get into that. I'll explain. So let's recap. Let's take a look at what happens when a believer dies. Okay? Believer dies, 2 Corinthians 5:8 tells us, we are confident then and would much prefer to leave our home in the body and come to our home with the Lord. Yes. Now, when you go to a funeral and they say grandma's dancing with Jesus, that's not true. Because grandma doesn't have a body, and you can't dance without a body. And I could prove it to you because, even though I wouldn't do this, but if we exhume the body, 2 days after the funeral, grandma's body's still going to be in the ground. The soul goes. This is what the Bible tells us. When a believer dies, the body is in the grave, but the soul/spirit, and those terms are used interchangeably. It's neshama in Hebrew. They go to be with the Lord in heaven or paradise. This is the disembodied state that exists between death and resurrection. You're not resurrected yet. You understand? A resurrection, you get a body. You don't have a body yet. So Paul was teaching that there's good, better, and best. You know what good is? Right now. This is good. You're saved, and the Holy Spirit's in your tabernacle. Is that good? Yes. That's not better than dying, but nobody wants to die. He's saying right here that it is absolutely better to die, because then you're free, and you're at total bliss and peace, and your soul is free. I guarantee if you were able to go there with Paul, and you were able to talk to any of those souls who are there, I'm telling you flat out that if you ask them if they want to come back and get their body, they would absolutely say no. So why is everybody afraid to die? It's a mystery. Because I know a lot of people know that scripture too, and they quote it. Especially at funerals, right? Well, she's in a better place. Then why don't you believe that for yourself? Why did we believe it for everybody else? Crazy, no? Crazy. Now, that's good right now. Better is to die. That's still not the best. The best is after the resurrection, when we get our new body. When we don't need any more ectomies. You know what I mean? Come on. Everybody's had to go to a dermatologist. What is this? It's a thing. I'm just going to cut it off. What do you mean just going to cut it? I'm just going to cut it off. We won't have that anymore. This is the destiny. This is our reward, and it's real. We're not being hoodwinked. It's real. We hold on to this. We want this. Let's make this as good as can be. Where is your faith? Where is your belief? Where's your biblical understanding of the afterlife? Now let's see what happens when a non-believer dies. 16:23, in Sheol, where he was in torment, the rich man looked up and saw Abraham far away with Elazar at his side. His body goes into the grave, but his soul finds itself in a state of suffering, but not hell yet. This place is not hell. It's a holding tank. The final hell is called Gehenna. You've heard Gehenna? It's a term used in the New Testament derived from the Hebrew word Gehenom. It's used 23 times in the Bible, and get this, 15 times out of Yeshua's mouth. Which means Yeshua had a lot to say about hell, but pastors today have nothing to say about it. Pretty amazing. The guy talked about hell on a regular basis, and we're supposed to be followers of him and preachers of his word, and we never talk about it anymore. Who wants to talk about that? That's a downer. Well, how do you think they're going to feel when they're in Sheol? Luke 16, you know what happened to that man? He said, okay, you can't cool off my tongue. He becomes an evangelist. I've got brothers, let me tell them. It's too late to be an evangelist once you go. Tell people the truth, for God's sakes. Yes, I know, I lose friends all the time. Just a best friend recently, one of my best friends. I'm not sure where we stand, because he told me, well, I went to this funeral, and the guy died, and his two sons, he's going to get to see his two sons. And I go, were his two sons saved? Well, that's what the priest said. Well, how do you know? I'm not going to judge him. I said, I'm not judging him, but a tree is known by his fruit. And then people hate me. Who are you to say? Well, I'm giving you chapter and verse. Who am I to say? I don't know nothing. I'm not saying nothing. I'm parroting what he said. Look at Luke 12, 4 through 5. This is Yeshua speaking. not Rabbi Greg, Rabbi Yeshua. He says, my friends, I tell you, don't fear those who kill the body, but then have nothing more they can do. I will show you whom to fear. Fear him who, after killing you, has authority. Satan has the authority to throw you into Gehenna. Does Satan do it? It's your decision that does it. Satan doesn't make you do anything. Yes, I tell you, this is the one to fear. Satan can kill your body. He can, at times, if God allows it. But he can't take your soul. Only God makes that decision. Death can be thought of as a separation. Physical death is a separation of our body from our soul and our spirit, while spiritual death is the separation of our soul from God. I don't get the details about this separation, but the thought of a place where there's no love and no light and no God is bone-chilling to me. Bone-chilling. Yeshua taught that we should not fear physical death, yet we fear it all the time. This is how fragile we are. And I don't want anybody in here acting like super spiritual when everybody in here has been sick and is afraid of dying. That is normal. It's part of the human experience. Don't make like you're not. But Yeshua is saying, think about this though. Try to just come out of the fear a little bit in faith. We should be much more concerned about our spiritual death than our physical death. Let's take a look at this word Gehenna. Gehenna in the Hebrew, and it means hell. This was the original valley of Hinnom, which is south of Jerusalem. It's right there, right outside of Jerusalem. You can walk to it. And this was where the filth and the dead animals of the city were cast out and burned for centuries, which obviously Yeshua is using as a fit symbol of the wicked and their future destruction. So we see that the words hell and Gehenna are one and the same. You can use them interchangeably, okay? What about the lake of fire? The lake of fire is mentioned only in the book of Revelation. It is also a term used for the final hell, the place of eternal punishment. Let me show you Revelation 19:20. It says, but the beast was taken captive, and with it the false prophet, who in its presence had done the miracles. You've got an unholy trinity, if you will. You've got Satan, the beast, and the false prophet. And they did miracles which he had used to deceive those. By the way, don't get too caught up in miracles, guys. Some of them are satanic. Don't look for miracles. Look for the miracle maker. There's people that run and gun. I remember in the 90s, you know, when the faith was coming on the scene, and people run, oh, this guy has the gift, and this guy has the gift. And he took his jacket and he threw it, and 200 people fell down. And what did that do? You ever ask him, so what happened when you fell down? Well, I hit my head. I went to sleep. How did it change you? It's a matter of trusting and obeying. That's what the faith is all about. Not gimmicks. Where's Benny Hinn today, by the way? Do you know what his life is like right now? And do you know that he does not have one, and I'm telling you because it's the truth, he does not have one documented medical miracle that he could prove of the millions that went down. You tell me what's more impressive, getting a miraculous healing or praising God in the midst of your horror. But the beast was taken captive, and with it the false prophet, who in its presence had done the miracles which he had used to deceive those who had received the mark of the beast and those who had worshipped the image. The beast and the false prophet were both thrown alive into the lake of fire that burns with sulfur. Some of your versions say brimstone. I don't think anybody ever knew what brimstone was, but it's sulfur. Here's the deal. In a desperate attempt to pervert Yeshua from taking the reins of government at the very end of the tribulation, the beast allies with the armies of the world. Don't you see what's going on in the world today? It's so blatant to make war against his army. They think they could defeat him. They're pretty convinced we're going to defeat them. We're going to rule and reign, not Yeshua. But it is a futile attempt. Both the beast and the false prophet are captured and hurled into the lake of fire and sulfur. Revelation 20:10, it says, the adversary who had deceived them was also hurled. This is Satan himself, where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Here the devil himself is cast into the lake of fire to join the beast and the false prophet. It may seem surprising that Satan would be able to assemble an army at the end of the millennium. Right? A lot of people don't even know what the millennium is for. They're like, who needs the millennium? I mean, just judge us and bring the new heavens and the new earth. Who needs this 1,000-year interlude, right? You got the tribulation, you fight Armageddon, fine. Okay, bring the new heavens and the new earth where there's no sickness, no sadness, and no suffering. Does that make sense? So what is the purpose of the millennium? You ever look into it? Most people don't even believe in the millennium. They said that God meant with 1,000 years, that he meant a really long time. Well, first of all, God would have said he meant a really long time. Secondarily, 6 times in the book of Revelation, he says 1,000 years, and for 1,000 years, you reign for 1,000 years, 1,000. It's literal, man. Don't make something figurative, not literal. It's literal. You got to remember that during the millennium, children will be born. They will be born during Messiah's reign. It's not the new heavens and the new earth yet. And I don't even need to look at the book of Revelation because the book of Isaiah tells all this to me. They'll be born in sin, just like we were. And they will need to be saved. Not all will accept him as the rightful king, and these will scatter throughout the earth, trying to get as far away from Jerusalem as possible. Revelation 20:14-15. Then death and Sheol. Now it's getting real good. First, the beast and the false prophet. Then Satan himself, and he gets out a little bit to try to sway the people. You're still going to have a chance to say no. God is such a gentleman and so loving that he doesn't want to force you into the millennium and say, now you have to stay. You're still going to have a choice. And during that millennium time, guess who's going to be teaching? Right. So guess who's going to finally shut up? And you. Because finally, we won't be arguing with Rabbi, because that Rabbi knows everything. And he has to teach us his ways in Isaiah 2, because we didn't get it, because we thought Sunday was the new Shabbat, and pork is the other white meat. He's going to teach us his ways. It says so in Isaiah 2. It will come from Jerusalem. He's going to sit and rule and reign, and he's going to teach us. And then when we finally get it after 1,000 years and things are spiraling up, people die at 300, people die at 500. Finally, then we have the pomp and circumstance, and we get the graduation. And the new heavens and the new earth. And then it's over. It's glory land. No marriage, no sickness, no sadness, no sorrow, no sin, no death, no shame, no guilt. It's heaven on earth. When we read here that death and Hades are cast into the lake of fire, it means the complete persons, their spirit, their soul, and their body. The text explains that this is the second death. So again, we see that there is a difference between Hades and hell. For the non-believer who have died, Hades is a disembodied state of conscious punishment. Okay? If I die, body's in the grave, I go to heaven, paradise, Abraham's bosom, whatever you want to call it. I'm with the Lord, my soul. Non-believer, he goes to this, disembodied, he doesn't have his body anymore, but he's in a place of conscious punishment. Do you follow? That's what the text is telling us. It is sort of a holding tank. It's an intermediate condition where they await the judgment of the great white throne. You see, they don't get to spend time in the millennium. Very sad. Hell is the final prison of the wicked dead. It is the same as the lake of fire and sulfur and Gehenna and the second death. They all could be used interchangeably. Simple? So far, so good? For the most part, the deciding factor at this judgment is whether one's name is written in the book of life. Actually, if a person's name had been inscribed in the book of life, he would have already been part of the first resurrection. So let's look at the last verse here, 26 of Revelation. It says, "Blessed and holy is anyone who has part in the first resurrection. Over him the second death has no power." What is he saying? better to be born twice and die once than to be born once and die twice. The first resurrection is a raising up for all believers. The second death has no power over these. The second death refers to unbelievers of all ages who will be raised at the end of the millennium to stand before the judgment of the great white throne. I recently found out, I told you that most Christians do not believe in a literal millennial reign of Messiah Yeshua. It's bizarre. I mean, the Bible says it 6 times, verses 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 of chapter 20. Secondarily, don't you realize that God made 5 covenants? The Abrahamic covenant promises a land. Has Israel ever had those borders? So do you think God's not going to fulfill a covenant? What about the Israeli covenant? Deuteronomy 30. It says that the exiles will be restored to the land. God's got to do that. What about the Davidic covenant? Where do we read that? In Samuel. What does he say? That he will rule and reign. The Messiah will come and sit on his throne. This isn't figurative, man. Who told you that it's figurative language? The Messiah has to come. So not only does he speak about the 1,000 years 6 times, but we have to fulfill the Abrahamic, Israeli, and Davidic covenants. There's a land, there's a restoration of the outcast, and the descendant of David has to literally sit on the throne. What great rejoicing. Don't you get it? Don't you understand all that you've been through? I've had such a horrible life. First of all, I can show you people that had a worse horrible life than you, kiddo. You've got clothes on your back, and you probably drove here in an air-conditioned vehicle. I know we all go through stuff. I get it. It's not easy being a human being, but we are sick, psycho, over-the-top blessed in this country, whether you realize it or not. But the fact of the matter is, whatever you go through, I don't care how horrific it is. When you hear, "Well done, good and faithful servant, enter the joy of your rest," all that pain and suffering, and I mean horrific pain. I'm talking about losing children, losing multiple children. I'm talking about, I promise you, you hear it now, it's going to feel like a pinprick when you hear that. God is not a liar. This is a reward for those who stay faithful, for those who persevere, for those who are willing to lose their friends, willing to lose their family, putting Yeshua first. There is a reward for them, but not for everybody. Not for those who just give him lip service and say, "Well, Jesus is Lord." The devil knows Jesus is Lord. It's going to be great rejoicing. I've been to some good parties. I'm telling you, man. Some of you know how to party. Some of you know how to party a little too well. It's like you have a doctorate in partying. But nevertheless, not all your parties, not your greatest days, not your most euphoric moments in this planet is going to compare to what you're going to feel at the first resurrection. Sadly enough, there will be great anguish at the second resurrection. So stop studying and start preaching the gospel. For those of us who are destined for the first resurrection, we have a responsibility to tell the whole world. G.B. Hardy, a world-renowned mathematician as well as a brilliant scientist who specializes in population genetics, with too many medals and awards for me to name, once said, and I quote, "I have only 2 questions to ask. 1, has anyone ever defeated death? 2, did he make a way for me to do it also?" It's planted in the midst of a person. Nobody doesn't believe in God. They're just angry at him. The answer to both of Hardy's questions is a resounding yes. One person has both defeated death and has provided a way for everyone who puts their trust in him to overcome it as well. No one who trusts in Messiah Yeshua needs to fear death, and we can rejoice in our salvation. 1 Corinthians 15:55 says, "Death, where is your victory? Death, where is your sting? Through faith in Yeshua, come on, raise up your faith. Don't just sit here like you're in some theoretical class, like you're just some little college student learning some theory. Get this in your soul, man. Get it in your soul today. Through faith in Yeshua, we have victory over death and over the grave. Death is robbed of its sting. It is a known fact that when certain insects sting a person, they leave their sting embedded in the person's flesh, and being thus robbed of their sting, they die. In a very real sense, death stung itself to death at the execution stake of Yeshua at Golgotha. And now the king of terrors, death itself, the king of terrors is robbed of his terror as far as the believer is concerned. In other words, Yeshua's death is the death of our death. Somebody say hallelujah. We can now say with humble confidence, because it wasn't us that did it. Hey, death, who's afraid of you now? Let's end our lesson with a concluding appeal from Rav Shaul, a.k.a. the Apostle Paul, in light of the resurrection, 1 Corinthians 15:58. So, my dear brothers, stand firm and immovable, always doing the Lord's work as vigorously as you can, knowing that united with the Lord, your efforts are not in vain. Hallelujah and Shabbat Shalom. Let's stand together. Now may the Lord bless you and keep you. May the Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. And may the Lord lift up his very countenance upon you and give you his peace. In the name of the Prince of all peace, Yeshua. Yevarechecha Adonai v'yishmerecha. Yo'er Adonai panov elecha v'hunecha. Yisa Adonai panov elecha. V'yasem lecha shalom. God bless you guys. Shabbat shalom.